In this video, we'll cover Chapter 35, Part 2, and we'll begin with the War in the Pacific. The early successes of Japan's militarists were breathtaking. They realized that they would have to win quickly or lose slowly, and they expanded rapidly in the Far East. They took the American outposts of Guam, Wake, and the Philippines. They seized the British-Chinese city port of Hong Kong and British Malaya. They plunged into the jungles of Burma and lunged southward to take the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. Better news came from the Philippines, which succeeded in slowing down the Japanese. When the Japanese landed, General Douglas MacArthur withdrew to a strong defensive position at Bataan, not far from Manila. Here, 20,000 American troops, supported by the force of ill-trained Filipinos, held off the Japanese attacks until April 9, 1942. But before the inevitable American surrender, MacArthur was ordered to depart secretly for Australia. His army remnants were treated with vicious cruelty in the infamous 80-mile Bataan Death March to the prisoner of war camps. These were the first in the series of atrocities committed by both sides. In the island fortress of Corregidor in Manila Harbor, the Americans held out until May 6, 1942, when it too surrendered, which left the Japanese forces in complete control of the Philippine archipelago. This map shows Corregidor and Bataan. Japan's continual march invaded New Guinea and landed on the Solomon Islands, was finally checked by the naval battle fought in the Coral Sea in May of 1942. America, with Australian support, inflicted heavy losses on the victory-flushed Japanese. This was the first time the fighting was done by carrier-based aircraft. Japan next undertook to seize Midway Island, which led to the epochal Battle of Midway on June 3rd to the 6th, 1942, where Admiral Chester Nimitz forced the Japanese to retreat after the U.S. naval aircraft sank 4 vitally important carriers. Midway was a pivotal battle. It was combined with the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the U.S. success at Midway halted Japan's offensive. Japan did get America's islands of Kiska and Attu, which caused fear of invasion of the United States through Alaska. The Japanese imperialists, overextended in 1942, suffered from victory disease, and their appetites were bigger than their stomachs. America seized the initiative in the Pacific through a leapfrogging campaign. In 1942, the Americans gained a toehold on Guadalcanal Island. The Japanese troops evacuated the island in February 1943, and Japanese losses were 20,000 compared with 1,700 for the Americans. The American and Australian forces under General MacArthur held on to New Guinea, which was the last buffer protecting Australia, and the scales of war began to tip. The U.S. Navy, with Marines and Army divisions, began leapfrogging Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. This island-hopping strategy called for the bypassing the most heavily fortified Japanese ports, capturing nearby islands, setting up airfields on them, and then neutralizing the enemy bases in using heavy bombing. This deprived essential supplies from home, and Japan's outposts would slowly wither on the vine without them. This is a picture titled Hell in the Pacific, which shows that American soldiers often perished as they stepped ashore in New Guinea in 1942. This appeared on Life magazine in 1943, nearly 2 years after Pearl Harbor. This was the first photograph of dead GIs that the War Department allowed to be published. Brilliant successes crowned the American attacks on the Japanese island strongholds in the Pacific. The Gilbert Islands fell in late 1943, followed by the Marshall Islands in early 1944, and especially prized were the Marianas, including Guam. The assault opened on June 19, 1944, and 250 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, with the loss of only 29 American planes. The following day, in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the United States Navy sank several Japanese carriers, and the Japanese Navy never recovered. After a mass suicide of surviving Japanese soldiers and civilians from the suicide cliff on Saipan, the Marianas fell to the United States in July to August 1944. The bombing of Japan by the new B-29s began in November of 1944. This shows the United States thrusts into the Pacific. There were 4 proposed plans for waging war against the Japanese. One by defeating the Japanese in China by funneling supplies over the Himalayan hump from India. The second was carrying the war into Southeast Asia. The third was heavy bombing of Japan by Chinese air bases. And then the fourth, which was settled on, was the island hopping campaign, which put American forces within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. And this strategy was favored by General Douglas MacArthur and was the one that was finally emphasized. The Allied halting of Hitler began during this time period also, and Hitler increased the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942 using submarine wolf packs. The tide of the subsea battle turned slowly. Old techniques were strengthened by new methods of the air patrol, the newly invented technology of radar, and the bombing of submarine bases. These Allied tactics further were helped by the British codebreakers. So by the spring of 1943, the Allies had their upper hand against the U-boats, which was vital for Allied military operations in Europe. The turning point of the land-air war against Hitler came in 1942 when the British launched a 1,000-plane raid on Cologne in May. In August, they joined the American Air Force in bombing German cities. The Germans, under Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, drove across North Africa into Egypt. By October of 1942, the British General Bernard Montgomery delivered the attack at El Alamein, west of Cairo. With the aid of the American tanks, he drove Rommel back to Tunisia. In September 1942, the Russians stalled the German steamroller at Stalingrad, the graveyard of Hitler's hopes. Scores of invading divisions surrendered, and by November of 1942, the Russians began crushing the counteroffensive. By 1943, Stalin had regained about two-thirds of the blood-soaked Soviet motherland from the German invader. The Second Front, from North Africa to Rome, incurred heavy losses. The Soviets lost millions of soldiers, and civilians lay dead by 1942 as Hitler's armies overran most of the western USSR. Anglo-American losses were only in the thousands by 1942, and by the war's end, some 20 million Soviets had died. Americans, including FDR, wanted to invade France in 1942 or 1943 to prevent Russian defeat. But the British military was not enthusiastic about a frontal attack on German-held France. The Americans reluctantly agreed to postpone the massive invasion of Europe, and the assault on the French-held North Africa was a compromise on the Second Front. The attack in November 1942, led by American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, with joint Allied operations, this invasion was the mightiest waterborne effort up to that time in history, and after savage fighting, the remnants of the German-Italian army was trapped in Tunisia and surrendered in May of 1943. This is a picture of women at war, the Women's Army Corps, disembarking in North Africa. At Casablanca, Roosevelt met with Churchill in January of 1943, and the Big Two agreed to step up the Pacific War, to invade Sicily, to increase pressure on Italy, and to insist on unconditional surrender of the enemy. Unconditional surrender was one of the most controversial moves of the war, and the main criticism was that it steeled the enemy to fight to the last man. This discouraged anti-war groups in Germany from revolting, and no one can prove that unconditional surrender either shortened or lengthened the war. But what is known, by crushing the German government, the policy forced a thorough post-war reconstruction. The Allied forces, which were victorious in North Africa, turned against the not-so-soft underbelly in Europe. Sicily fell in August of 1943, and Mussolini was deposed as a result. Italy surrendered unconditionally in September of 1943, and Hitler's troops in Italy resisted the Allied invaders. Germans also unleashed their fury against Italians who declared war on Germany in October 1943. Rome was finally taken on June 4, 1944, and the Allies continued to fight in northern Italy. On May 2, 1945, only 5 days before Germany's officially surrender, several 100,000 Axis troops in Italy laid down their arms and became prisoners of war. D-Day is June 6, 1944. The Soviets never ceased to clamor for an all-out second front. So at Tehran, which was the capital of Iran, which was formerly Persia, was chosen as the meeting place for Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, November 28 to December 1, 1943. The meeting progressed smoothly with a key achievement. They agreed on broad plans, especially for launching Soviet attacks on Germany from the east, simultaneously with a U.S.-British cross-channel invasion of France, which was to become D-Day. This is a picture of the Big Two, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the Casablanca Conference in Morocco, 1943. D-Day occurred on June 6, 1944. This was an enormous operation and involved some 4,600 vessels. After desperate fighting, the invaders broke out of the iron ring that enclosed Normandy, the Normandy landing zone. There were spectacular lunges across France by American armored divisions under General Patton. The retreat of German defenders hastened when American-French forces landed in August 1944 on the southern coast of France and swept north. With the assistance of the French underground, Paris was liberated in August of 1944. The Allied forces rolled irresistibly towards Germany, and the first important German city of Aachen fell to the Americans in October 1944, and the days of Hitler's thousand-year Reich were numbered. This is a famous picture showing the Allied landing in Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944. This map shows World War II in Europe and North Africa from 1939 to 1945. FDR was the fourth-term president and the only person who had served more than 2 terms. In the presidential campaign of 1944, the Republicans met in Chicago with hopeful enthusiasm. They quickly nominated Thomas Dewey, who was a mild internationalist. They nominated for Vice President Senator John Bricker of Ohio, who was a strong isolationist. This platform called for an unstinted prosecution of the war and creation of a new international organization to maintain the peace. The Democrats had FDR, who was the indispensable man. He was nominated at Chicago on the first ballot by acclamation. In a sense, he was the forgotten man of the convention. Most of the attention was focused on the vice presidency. Henry Wallace, having served 4 years as vice president, desired the renomination. Conservative Democrats distrusted him, though, as unpredictable. So a Ditch Wallace campaign developed momentum. With Roosevelt's blessing, the nomination eventually went to Senator Harry Truman of Missouri, and it was called the New Missouri Compromise. Dewey took the offensive in the campaign and denounced the tired and quarrelsome old men in Washington. He proclaimed that after 12 long years of New Dealism, it was time for a change. As for the war, he would not alter the basic strategy, but would fight it better, a type of Me Tooism, which was ridiculed by the Democrats. The fourth-term issue did not figure prominently into the campaign, and Republicans claimed to fear the fifth and sixth terms by the lifer in the White House. A new political action committee of the CIO was organized to get around the law banning direct use of union funds for political purposes. FDR was opposed by the majority of newspapers, which were owned chiefly by Republicans, but the results of the election showed Roosevelt winning a sweeping victory, winning clearly 432 to 99 in the Electoral College, and certainly the majority of the popular vote. Roosevelt won primarily because the war was going well, and foreign policy was the decisive factor. They felt he had the strength and experience needed in fashioning the future organization for world peace, and that Dewey had spoken of international cooperation, but the isolationist Bricker had implanted serious doubts. Republicans still suffered from the taint of isolationism. The last days of Hitler. Hitler's last attempt. On December 16, 1944, the Germans attacked the American lines in the Ardennes forests. The objective was the Belgian port of Antwerp, which was key to the Allied supply operation. This 10-day operation was halted after the 101st Airborne Division stood firm at Bastogne. Brigadier General McCulloch defiantly answered the German demand for surrender with one word: nuts. Reinforcements rushed up, and the last gasp Hitlerian offensive was stemmed in the Battle of the Bulge, shown in the map that I'll show you in a minute. In March of 1945, American troops reached Germany's Rhine River. This map shows the Battle of the Bulge, which took place from December 1944 to January 1945. Eisenhower's troops reached the Elbe River in April of 1945, and the Americans and the Soviets clasped hands there. The Americans found the concentration camps where the Nazis had engaged in scientific mass murder of undesirables and an estimated 6 million Jews. The American government had long been informed of Hitler's campaign of genocide against the Jews, and the U.S. had been reprehensibly slow to take steps against it. Roosevelt's administration had bolted the doors against large numbers of Jewish refugees, and the U.S. military commanders refused to bomb the rail lines that carried the victims to the camps. Until the war's end, the full dimensions of the Holocaust were actually not known. This is a picture showing the horror of the Holocaust. And although there was some knowledge of the Nazi death camps before the war's end, the full revelation of Hitler's atrocities were evident as the Allies overran Germany in the spring of 1945. The Soviets reached Berlin in April of 1945, and Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. Roosevelt had died on April 12th, 1945, and Truman had taken the helm. On May 7, 1945, the German government surrendered unconditionally, and May 8th was officially proclaimed VE Day, which meant Victory in Europe Day. This is a picture of American and Soviet soldiers that met in Germany in 1945. Japan dies hard. The war with Japan continued, and American submarines called the Silent Service sank over 1,000 Germany's merchant marine ships, 50% of Japan's entire life-sustaining merchant fleet. The giant bomber attacks were more spectacular. They reduced Japan's cities to cinders. A massive firebomb raid in Tokyo, March 10th to the 11th, or 9th to the 10th, 1945, destroyed over 250 buildings, which was 250,000 buildings, which was a quarter of the city, and killed an estimated 83,000 people. But General MacArthur was on the move. After his conquest of New Guinea, he moved northwest for the Philippines with 600 ships and 250,000 men. He landed at Leyte Island on October 20th, 1944, and Japan's Navy made one last effort to destroy MacArthur. In a gigantic clash at Leyte Gulf, fought on the air or on sea and in the air, there were actually 3 battles. The Americans won all 3, and Japan was finished as a sea power. They lost about 60 ships. Overrunning Leyte, MacArthur landed on the main island of Luzon in January 1945, and Manila was his major objective, and that city fell in March. The Philippines were not fully conquered until July, and the American toll was over 60,000 casualties. Iwo Jima was captured in March of 1945 after a 25-day assault that cost over 4,000 American lives. Okinawa took place, the Battle of Okinawa, from April to June 1945, and 50,000 American casualties took place, while the Japanese suffered far heavier losses. The U.S. Navy, which covered the invasion of Okinawa, sustained severe damage as well, and Japanese suicide pilots called kamikazes crashed their bomb-laden planes into the invading fleet and sank over 30 ships and badly damaged scores more. This is a famous picture of the flag raising at Iwo Jima atop Mount Suribachi. Washington had been planning an all-out invasion of Japan, and Tokyo had secretly sent out peace feelers to Moscow. The Americans, having broken the secret Japanese radio code, knew of the feelers, and the bomb-scorched Japan showed no outward willingness to surrender unconditionally to the Allies. So at the Potsdam Conference, which took place near Berlin in July of 1945, Truman met in the 17-day parley with Stalin and British leaders. The conference issued a strong ultimatum to Japan: surrender or be destroyed. U.S. bombers showered a warning to Japan in tens of thousands of leaflets. No encouraging response was received. America had a fantastic ace up his sleeve. In 1940, Albert Einstein had persuaded Roosevelt to push for unlocking the secret of the atomic bomb. And Congress, at Roosevelt's request, had made available $2 billion, which resulted in the Manhattan Project. This project pushed feverishly forward. In the desert of New Mexico, on July 16, 1945, experts detonated the first awesome and devastating atomic device. With Japan still refusing to surrender, the Potsdam threat was fulfilled, and on August 6, 1945, the lone American bomber dropped one atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. About 180,000 people were killed, wounded, or missing. Some 70,000 died instantaneously. 60,000 more soon perished from burns and from radiation sickness. 2 days later, on August 8th, Stalin entered the war against Japan. This is a picture of the aftermath of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, August 1945. This shows the comparative costs of World War II by country in terms of military deaths, civilian deaths, government expenditures, and damage to civilian property. The formal end to the war came with dramatic force on September 2nd, 1945. The official surrender was conducted by General MacArthur on the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. At the same time, Americans at home hysterically celebrated VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. This is a picture of the Japanese surrender aboard the Missouri in Tokyo Harbor, September 2nd, 1945. And a picture of VJ Day in Times Square, painted by Edward Danzig, 1947. World War II was terribly costly, and the American forces suffered some 1 million casualties, more than one-third of which were deaths, and the losses were sharply reduced because of the blood plasma and miracle drugs, notably penicillin. The Soviets suffered casualties many times greater. More than 25 million people were killed. This was the first war that killed more civilians than armed combatants. Other results was America emerged with their mainland virtually unscathed. A few Japanese firebombs drifted across the Pacific and killed 6. Much of the rest of the world was utterly destroyed and destitute. This was the best fought war in American history. We were unprepared at first, but the nation was better prepared than in earlier wars. Fighting the German submarines before Pearl Harbor was an occurrence was successful, and the United States proved to be resourceful, tough, adaptable, and able to accommodate itself to tactics of relentlessness and a ruthless army. U.S. leadership proved to be of the highest order. We had brilliant generals like Eisenhower, MacArthur, and George Marshall, who was the Chief of Staff, Admirals Nimitz and Spruance. In collaboration, because of Roosevelt and Churchill in the planning strategy, made things better. Industrial leaders were skilled, and the marvels of the production were performed daily. Assembly lines proved as important as the battle lines, and the victory went to the side with the most smokestacks in the end. The Axis was smothered by bayonets, bullets, bazookas, and bombs. The American way of war was simply more. More men, more weapons, more machines, more technology, and more money than any enemy could hope to match. From 1940 to 1945, the output of American factories was simply phenomenal. The Americans had given the answer. Democracy had overthrown and discredited the dictators. While Washington exercised a lot of control over individuals during the wartime emergency, the American people were able to preserve their precious liberties without serious impairment. This is the chronology from the chapter.